ought to be alert and in contact so that changes can be discussed quickly. If Kim was, then the price of having that meeting would go up. Well, I think it's possible he will try to get a different agreement with a larger South Korean contribution, because that's what he always does. And if the Biden administration did it, he'd probably want to try and change it. But a lot depends on who the defense secretary turns out to be and really what the situation is in the region. But with Trump, things are always up in the air. I think South Korea should say, look, we just went through this before, and we did talk with you and your administration in the first term about increasing South Korea's contribution, and in fact that's what happened in this latest negotiation. But it will require, I think, the South Korean government to make contact very early with the new administration, find out who will be responsible for these kinds of issues, and try and explain in advance what changes have taken place, since many of these officials will have been in government the last time, so that they know it's not the same circumstance they faced 4 years ago. Well, I think depending on how the circumstances in the region are, there may well be changes we have to make because of increased concern about North Korea, increased concern about China, threats to Taiwan. Events are moving very fast these days, and there may be all kinds of changes we need. Disposition of U.S. forces on the peninsula, ROK capabilities. So we're in a period of rapid change, and therefore I think considering alternatives in advance and talking about them plainly between the two allies would make a lot of sense. Well, for Trump, everything is a negotiation, and numbers come and go. Tomorrow it could be 20 billion, maybe the day after it'd be 5 billion. It's I think that's why having talks at the expert level, reminding people about the negotiation with the Biden administration, talking to the new political appointees, because there are many questions that have to be considered on a continuing basis. I think there have been important steps forward, for example, in reinforcing the U.S. nuclear deterrent and questions like that. But with events moving rapidly, I think everybody ought to be alert and in contact so that changes can be discussed quickly. Well, Trump believed and said that he thought if he had good relations with the leader of a foreign government, good personal relations, that meant that U.S. relations with that government were also good. Now, I certainly wouldn't discount the importance of personal relations in foreign affairs, but they're not equivalent to the national interest of the two countries, and whether with allies or with adversaries. Trump said at one point that he and Kim Jong-un fell in love. I don't think Kim Jong-un fell in love with Trump. I think Trump may have fallen in love with him because Kim Jong-un pursued what North Korea wanted, which was to continue the nuclear program. I think both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin look at Trump who's somebody who they think they can manipulate. I think that's very concerning for the United States, because I don't think Trump understands that. But it's not feelings of personal friendship that they have, it's the feeling that they know how to manipulate Trump. A lot depends on the circumstances that he faces when he takes office. The first priority, pretty clearly, is the expulsion of illegal immigrants from the United States. And they have been doing a lot of preparatory work. It's a huge undertaking. It may succeed, it may not succeed. Logistically, it's very difficult. But outside events may press on them. The first, for example, may be the conflict in Ukraine after following the Russian invasion. And he may turn to that, not necessarily because that's a higher priority than the threat from China or the nuclear threat from North Korea or the war in the Middle East. It just may be that circumstances on the battlefield in Ukraine or the desire by Ukraine or Russia for some kind of agreement really impose themselves on Trump. You don't have the luxury of necessarily doing first what you want to do first. The rest of the world has a vote on that too. You know, I think Trump liked the meetings with Kim Jong-un because he got such amazing publicity. Indeed, the meeting at the DMZ was purely for publicity, since nothing substantive came out of it. And I worry that at a time when North Korea is becoming more threatening, when its ballistic missile program is more developed, that giving Kim Jong-un more legitimacy strengthens the belief in Pyongyang that they can resist demands that they denuclearize. And I worry that looking for how to get the next big boost in publicity, Trump may decide to go to Pyongyang, which I think would be a mistake, but would be consistent with what Trump wants to do, which is get more press attention. You know, there has never been any evidence that North Korea has really made a strategic decision to give up nuclear weapons. In fact, the evidence is pretty clear that they've decided they want to keep pursuing nuclear weapons, but they'd like to be free of economic sanctions. They'd like tangible economic assistance. North Korea wants the best of both worlds, and if you go back to the agreed framework of the 1990s, to the negotiations with the Bush administration, that's what they got. They got economic benefits from the agreed framework. They got the potential of relief from sanctions from Bush, but they never gave up their nuclear program. They never really took any concrete steps. They've play-acted. They've demolished the cooling tower at Yongbyon, but they never actually gave up the program. So I think there's no serious possibility that you can have a diplomatic resolution as long as North Korea is basically lying about what its real intentions are. I think Trump sees that if he could get a deal that involved real denuclearization, you know, he would be a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. But he, during the first term at least, understood that if he made a bad deal, it would have very negative consequences for him in America politically. So correctly, he rejected Kim Jong-un's various proposals. Now, whether North Korea is now close enough to having deliverable nuclear weapons capabilities, we could find out, because the closer North Korea gets, the less interest they have even in meeting, let alone reaching an agreement. Well, he liked the idea of getting the Nobel Peace Prize, and frankly, if you had a situation where North Korea or Iran or another nuclear proliferator actually did denuclearize, that would be very significant. But it's easy for countries to say they're going to give up nuclear weapons. History's proven that they're not actually very likely to do it. Well, right now, Kim is in a very strong position because of the continuing progress North Korea has made, because sanctions enforcement against North Korea has weakened, and because Kim has been able to play on Russia's weakness to supply troops for combat in Ukraine, which I think opens the potential that he could get assistance from Russia regarding nuclear weapons and regarding ballistic missiles. And that is very unfortunate that we've allowed that to happen. So I think we're in a dangerous position, and we've got to be careful not to give Kim Jong-un the impression that we want to make too many concessions. Well, if Kim thought that Trump was more eager to have a meeting than Kim was, then the price of having that meeting would go up. And that's a very dangerous position for the US and South Korea and Japan to be in. Because if we look like we're the ones who need the meeting or need the agreement, I think Kim Jong-un would pick that up very quickly and use it as negotiating leverage, which would be bad for our side of the talks. Well, we don't know exactly what the terms are by which not only has North Korea provided troops for Russia, but artillery, ammunition, and perhaps other supplies as well. But every indication is that Russia was in a very difficult situation because of the losses that they have sustained in Ukraine. And North Korea was able to provide much needed supplies and troops. So I think the price that Kim extracted was likely to be pretty high. Well, I hope not. I mean, certainly North Korea wanted recognition. They wanted a peace treaty. They wanted a lot of things that they didn't get, but they came close in many cases, in Singapore and then in Hanoi in particular. What Trump does in a second term is very hard to predict. The correct policy is not to legitimize the North Korean regime any more than we already have. That was a mistake to begin with. I really think that economic conditions in North Korea continue to deteriorate. We don't know how bad the COVID pandemic really hit, but the conditions, I think, continue to be desperate. All that's prospering is the nuclear weapons program. Well, I think he will remember, and that could indicate to Trump that it's not worth trying again, at least not in the first year, that he may say, I've got other things to do. I don't want to have another meeting where I look as though I asked for the meeting and then didn't get anything. And even the publicity of going to Pyongyang to be the first American president to go there might not be enough to make up for a meeting that made no substantive progress. So these would be considerations on Trump's mind as well. Kim Jong-un, as best I can read him, doesn't appear to be too eager for a meeting. Now that just may be his tactical approach. But I think because Trump has other priorities, it's possible you could go many months into the administration before North Korea becomes a significant subject. It's always possible. He invited the Taliban to Camp David. It turned out that didn't happen. But if he thought he could make a big splash, certainly the first visit to the White House or Mar-a-Lago would be an enormous press event. But at some point people will ask, well, other than the publicity, what did you get out of it? And if the answer is we didn't get anything out of it, that may cause Trump to think twice about it. Well, it was always a possibility. We didn't want to meet in a place that benefited one party or the other, so that's why we met in Singapore and Hanoi. Kim doesn't like to travel very far. He doesn't like to travel by airplane. So that kind of limits the range, but and that's why I think a visit to Pyongyang might be on Trump's mind. But a visit to the United States or even to the west coast of the United States or to Hawaii would still be a significant invitation. Well, I hope it's a blessing, but knowing Trump, he has a way of not understanding the benefits of alliances. He's threatened to withdraw from NATO. He's spoken recently in the context of Greenland of considering the use of force, likewise with Panama and the Panama Canal. That's not really the best way to treat allies. So I've got, my hope is that no damage takes place, but I'm worried because Trump doesn't really get how alliances work. And I think in a dangerous world, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran may try and take advantage of us. So it's going to require a lot of work certainly in America, but I think also in South Korea for friends of the alliance in the political process to try and defend it if Trump looks like he's dissatisfied with it. I think it's very important to continue to try and strengthen trilateral cooperation. I give the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and the Biden administration great credit for making progress on that. I know it's difficult, particularly in South Korea because of the history, but the fact is we're all safer if we're working together. And I think there are other aspects, my personal view, other areas where South Korea can become more engaged in, for example, the Asian Security Quad, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. I think South Korea should join that. I think it should be a quint. I think the five should get together. I think that would be appropriate, and I think it would be very helpful. You know, the AUKUS agreement between the U.S., UK, and Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines is also a model for broader cooperation. Japan has said it's interested in participating in AUKUS. It's not just AUKUS, it's the idea, it's the concept of that kind of multinational agreement for common defense purposes, I think South Korea could be a very big participant in that kind of arrangement. Well, I think you know, my guess is the other Quad members would consider the idea favorably. You want to be sure of that diplomatically, but I think many Americans would say yes. We think South Korea is a critically important partner in this, and really should be invited to participate. I could see inviting others, Taiwan, Singapore, as time goes by. Well, I do think the North Korean threat is growing more sophisticated. Certainly from the U.S. point of view, they've still got a number of things they need to do before they can be sure they can hit targets in North America, but time is very short. We've wasted a lot of time over 30 years in a vain effort to try and persuade the North Koreans to give up something they consider critical to regime preservation in Pyongyang. And we've missed opportunities, and we need to talk about what we might do to prevent them from achieving the last successes they need to become a true nuclear power. But in my view, it's important that until we've completely lost that struggle, if that's what's going to happen, that we not think about South Korea or Japan or others from becoming nuclear powers themselves. Because every new country that gets nuclear weapons encourages others, and encourages, in this case, China to build up an even bigger nuclear weapons arsenal. You know, to do that, countries like South Korea have to feel confident that they can rely on the U.S. deterrent. The two governments have taken steps to make that commitment more visible, and I think that's progress. I think that's a good thing. There may be other things we should do. Consider redeploying U.S. tactical nuclear weapons on the peninsula to show the North Koreans in particular we're determined to resist any resumption of military hostilities. And it's not that I have any worry about the South Korean government possessing nuclear weapons, but as somebody who spent a lot of time on the subject, the more countries that have the capability, the more other countries who are hostile to the United States or not as dependable also have an incentive to get nuclear weapons. Look, I think given the North Korean and Chinese threats, that's a question that we have to ask ourselves seriously, and it requires obviously close consultation between Seoul and Washington. But it's a powerful capability, and if it strengthens the deterrent against a North Korean attack, I think we should certainly look at it. Well, I think you know, we ought to be open to discussing them. I mean, at some point you have to consider whether you take military action against North Korea's nuclear program. People in South Korea are obviously worried about that. They know the capabilities the North has on the DMZ. They know the vulnerability of Seoul. But at some point you have to ask, would you rather deal with North Korea before it becomes a nuclear power or after it becomes a nuclear power? Well, I think it's safe to say we know a lot. We may not know everything. There's one thing we said to the North Koreans: if you're serious about giving up your nuclear weapons, you tell us where your facilities are. Because what we know would tell us, if they didn't tell us everything, that they would be showing bad faith. And they didn't want to do that, which suggests that they're really not serious about disarmament. So if that's the case, then I'm not prepared to say, I guess we have to give up and accept the nuclear North Korea. I'm not prepared to say that yet. But we need to talk between the U.S. and South Korea's allies. If we still believe, and I think we do, we want to stop them from getting nuclear weapons, how do we do that? No, I would not interpret it that way. I think in the current circumstances, U.S. government officials or the incoming Trump administration are best advised not to say anything publicly. This is a very difficult time for South Korea. Having foreigners comment on what's happening in a public way really doesn't serve any purpose. I think the communications ought to be, you know, private through diplomatic channels. Well, you know, if the acting president was a potential presidential candidate, that might complicate politics too. I mean, it's understand the nature of the difficulty in South Korea, and I think that because some involvement by a U.S. president could be twisted by in the political process, it would just make it easier for everybody to say South Korea is going to work this through. It will achieve some result, and then the South Koreans will have to decide if they accept it. It complicates planning and cooperation during a dangerous period when one government is experiencing difficulty, but I think the U.S. needs to be careful not to make things even more difficult for South Koreans to resolve. I don't think so at this point. I think Ukraine's probably number one. I think the war in the Middle East is number two. And I think in the overall picture, the illegal immigration question, which has significant international ramifications, would be next. Yeah, look, I think Iran and North Korea as potential nuclear proliferators should be in the top 5. There's no doubt about it. Well, I think there's got to be very broad discussions between South Korea and the United States. We're, full partners, and I think everything needs to be on the table. And the U.S. has to hear from South Korea what its priorities are. And Trump was president during the Moon administration. It's a different time now. Circumstances have changed, and he needs to hear from South Korea what they think the current situation is across the board. Well, I think it was a good initiative. Trump tends to say, well, if the last president did it, I'm not going to do it, so it's a legitimate concern. But I think members of Congress who are familiar with it, Republican and Democratic, think it's a good idea. Hopefully they can persuade Trump to accept it. If he were to ask me, I would say he should continue it. Well, the tariff question is potentially quite important, except we don't know what kinds of tariffs Trump is going to put in place. But I think it's not to anybody's advantage to have a trade war, and there'll be a lot of debate in the United States about the tariffs. So hopefully we can avoid a trade war, but it's a problem that because Trump likes tariffs that we could face. Hopefully not, but I wouldn't underestimate it. Well, I think they're going to be the same, and I think there's going to be uncertainty and confusion because Trump doesn't think strategically. He doesn't have a grand strategy. He doesn't deal in policy the way people conventionally do. He's transactional and ad hoc in his decision making, and that has not changed from the first term.
Okay, thank you for your time, Ambassador Bolton.